They doubted these stones. They changed everything.
The stone chimney rose 14 feet above Josephine Langford's cabin roof in Montana Territory, just like every other settler's stack along Stillwater Creek. But in November of 1877, something else was rising outside that cabin that made the neighbors slow their wagons and stare. Dirt, wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of frozen Montana earth piled high beside the cabin wall, while the temperature dropped and the first serious winds of winter came pushing down from Canada. A woman was digging, not planting, not laying a root cellar for vegetables, digging deep deliberately in a pattern that made no sense to anyone who had ever built anything on the frontier. No one digs down when winter is coming. You stack wood. You check your chinking. You pray your roof holds and your livestock survives until March. You do not hire men to excavate beneath your own floor when the ground is already starting to freeze. Unless you know something the rest of the valley does not know. Or unless you have already lost everything that was keeping you reasonable. Josephine Langford had buried her husband Lars 3 months earlier in August on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the kind of blue that seems almost cruel in its indifference. A cottonwood log had shifted during a barn raising at the Dunbar property 2 miles north. Lars had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and by the time they carried him home, there was nothing left to do but send for Reverend Marsh and start thinking about what came next. What came next, according to the unspoken rules of the frontier, was practical and swift. A widow of 41 with no children had 2 paths. She could accept one of the offers that would arrive quietly at first and then more insistently from men who needed a capable woman to run a household. Or she could sell the 160 acres she and Lars had homesteaded, pack what she could carry, and return to something that resembled civilization. Back east, back to family, back to Ohio, where Lars's younger sister Dorothea still lived with her husband and their 4 children in a house with glass windows and a coal furnace and neighbors close enough to call out to from the porch. Josephine had listened to both suggestions with the same expression she gave to weather she could not change. Attentive, unresponsive, already thinking about something else. 3 weeks after the funeral, Dorothea Langford arrived from Columbus on the eastbound stage wearing good wool and carrying a leather bag that turned out to contain more than clothing. She had traveled 4 days to reach Stillwater Creek, and she had brought with her a folded document from a law office on High Street in Columbus, Ohio. The document was an offer to purchase 160 acres of Montana Territory land at a price that was, as the language carefully noted, reflective of current market conditions for properties without male management, 30% below what the land was worth. Josephine set the document on the table between them without reading past the first paragraph. The lamp between them burned low, throwing long shadows across the 2 women who had never been close but had always understood each other well enough to be careful. Dorothea said what she had come to say. She said it gently, which made it harder. She spoke about practical realities in long winters, in the particular vulnerability of a woman alone on the frontier with no children to help with the work and no husband to handle what men handled. She spoke about Lars, about what he would have wanted, about family being the only thing that mattered when everything else was stripped away. And then she set down the letter, not the legal document, a different letter, a personal one in Lars's handwriting dated 6 weeks before his death. He had written to his family in Ohio the way he sometimes did when the isolation of the frontier pressed in on him. And in that letter, he had mentioned Josephine the way a man mentions something he has decided not to worry about but cannot quite stop thinking about. Josephine has ideas he had written about heating the house differently, something her grandfather used in Sweden that she has been talking about since before we came here. I have told her I see no practical reason for it, and she has let the matter rest, but I know she has not given it up. Josephine read the letter twice. The lamplight made it difficult to be certain of every word, but she was certain enough. She set it down beside the legal document. Lars had known. He had known about the system she had described to him on the crossing from Sweden on the wagon trail west in the early years when they were still building and everything felt possible. He had listened and nodded and said what practical men say when their wives describe ideas that come from somewhere before America. That it was interesting, that they would see, that right now there were more pressing concerns. She had let it rest because Lars asked her to. She had carried the knowledge her grandfather had given her through 17 years of frontier life without building a single stone because Lars thought it was unnecessary, and she had chosen his judgment over her own. And now Lars was in the ground, and his sister was sitting across from her with a legal document, and somewhere in the silence of the cabin was the understanding that the only person who had ever asked her not to do this was no longer here to ask. Josephine folded both documents and slid them across the table toward Dorothea. "This is still my land," she said, "and I intend to keep it." Dorothea was not a cruel woman. That was the difficult thing about her. She was worried genuinely, and specifically worried in the way that people who love you from a distance are worried with all the concern and none of the understanding. She said that Lars would not have wanted this. She said that Josephine was being proud when she should be being wise. She said that Montana winters had killed stronger people than either of them. Josephine said that Lars was not here to want anything anymore. The sentence landed between them like something dropped from a height. Not angry, not bitter, just true in a way that ended the conversation more completely than any argument could have. Dorothea stayed for 2 more weeks. She cooked and she cleaned, and she watched Josephine hire 2 crow laborers and begin excavating beneath the cabin floor. And eventually she understood that no amount of practical concern was going to change what was already in motion. She booked her return passage on the stage and packed her leather bag and stood in the doorway on a cold morning in late November with the look of a woman who has done what she came to do and failed. "I hope you know what you are doing," Dorothea said. Josephine was already looking past her toward the 2 men with shovels. After the stage disappeared around the bend in the road, Josephine stood alone for a long moment in the cold. The excavation had been going for 4 days. The chamber beneath the cabin floor was already 6 feet deep, in places lined with the beginnings of the stonework she had been planning in her head for 17 years. She should have felt something clean. She felt something more complicated than that. She went inside and sat beside the low fire with Lars's field journal open on her knee. He had used it for weather records and planting notes and the small calculations of frontier life. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before he died. After the last entry, the pages were blank. She had been writing in those blank pages since October. Not her own words, not yet. Just numbers. Temperature readings taken every morning at the same time with the thermometer Lars had bought in Billings the winter before. She recorded them in the same careful hand he used for his own notes, filling the pages he had left empty with a different kind of evidence than he had imagined. She did not know yet whether the evidence would prove what she needed it to prove. She only knew that her grandfather's house in the valley outside Uppsala had been warm in January when the snow was 4 feet deep and the nearest neighbor was a mile through the forest. She knew what the stones beneath that floor had felt like under her bare feet as a child, warm in a way that no fire could explain, warm in a way that lasted through the night and into the next day, as if the earth itself were remembering summer. She was 41 years old, childless, and standing at the edge of what the frontier considered her useful life. She closed the journal and went back outside to work. The man Lars would have called her salvation arrived on a gray afternoon in the first week of December. One of the 2 crow laborers she had hired was a man called 2 Moons, 30 years old, compact and deliberate in his movements, who had been watching her work with an attention that was different from the attention of someone who was merely curious. He watched the way a man watches something he recognizes. On the 4th day of the excavation, he came to her with a piece of stone in his hand. He had walked to the bank of Stillwater Creek that morning before the others arrived and returned with a rock that was darker and heavier than the limestone most settlers used for their foundations. It was granite river-worn and dense, the kind that formed in the deep channels where the current ran fast and cold year-round. He held it out to her without speaking. She took it. It was noticeably heavier than the sandstone she had been considering. "Dense," he said. The word was careful in his mouth, selected rather than native. "Holds longer." She looked at the rock in her hand and then at the creek bank 50 yards away, where the same stone lay in abundance, rounded and ready free for the taking. She had been planning to use whatever was easiest to move. She had not been planning to be particular. 2 Moons explained it simply. The lighter stone cracked when it heated fast. The darker stone did not. He had seen it in the way his people used heated rocks for warmth in the cold months, and he had learned which stones survived the cycle and which ones split. The granite from the deep channel of Stillwater Creek was the right stone. It was the only stone worth using for what she was building. This was the piece of knowledge that changed the entire calculation. Not the system itself, which she already understood from memory and intention, but the specific material, the right granite from the right place selected by a man who had learned it through generations of cold weather survival that predated every homestead in this valley. She took it from him and carried it to the edge of the excavation and held it there for a moment before setting it down beside the others. "Thank you," she said. He returned to his shovel without ceremony. But from that day forward, every stone they moved came from the deep channel of Stillwater Creek, carried in by wheelbarrow from 50 yards away. It was harder work. It was the right work. The neighbors noticed all of it. The dirt piling up outside, the heavier stone being hauled in greater quantities than anyone could account for. The redirected chimney flue that Josephine had begun constructing inside the main chimney shaft, a secondary channel that branched away from the main flue 4 feet above the firebox and curved downward through the cabin floor before rejoining the main shaft near the roof. This was the part that made the old-timers shake their heads, not just the digging, the chimney itself. She was taking the hot exhaust gases that every other settler on Stillwater Creek sent directly up and out into the Montana sky, and she was routing them through a network of stone-lined channels beneath her floor before they could escape. The heat that other cabins wasted completely burning through cordwood at a rate that kept everyone in the valley calculating and worrying from October through April, she was capturing and storing in 4 tons of granite before it had a chance to disappear. The principle was not new. It was in fact old enough to predate the nation itself by 2 millennia. But on the Montana frontier in 1877, it looked like madness. Ambrose Dunbar arrived on a Wednesday. He was 53 years old, had homesteaded his 160 acres 7 years earlier, and had survived 2 winters on Stillwater Creek that killed off better prepared men than him. He had built 3 cabins in his life, each one better than the last. He understood construction the way men understand things. They have bet their lives on repeatedly, which is to say he understood it with his whole body, not just his mind. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down for a long time without speaking. Then he said what the valley was thinking. "You are going to run out of wood," he said. "You are burning through what you have twice as fast trying to heat stone and earth, and come February you will be burning furniture. And come March, Mrs. Langford, there will not be anything left to burn except the cabin itself." Josephine looked up from where she was working clay on her hands, and the particular confidence of a woman who has been certain of something for a very long time. She said that by February she expected to be burning half the wood he was burning and sleeping warmer than he had slept since leaving whatever heated house he had come from back east. Ambrose made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He was not cruel. He was experienced. There is a difference, and on the frontier it matters, because cruelty is about pleasure, and experience is about survival. And Ambrose Dunbar had never in his life taken pleasure in watching someone fail. He said heat rises. He said it the way he said things he knew to be true, which was without hesitation and without apology. Josephine said heat radiates. She said it the same way. They looked at each other across the excavation for a moment. 2 people who understood construction from different directions, and then Ambrose mounted his horse and rode north toward his property without a further word. Leroy Blackwell came 3 days later. He was 47, a former Union Army sergeant who had spent a winter at Fort Laramie and did not suffer fools. He had the bearing of a man who had learned to assess situations quickly because slow assessment had costs he had already paid. He dismounted at the edge of the site, studied the excavation through the gaps in the temporarily removed floorboards, and said what Ambrose had said, but with the precision of a military man who believes in exact communication. "Heat rises, Mrs. Langford. Always has. You are fighting nature. Heat radiates," she said, "in all directions. And stone holds it through the night, through the day after, through times when the fire is low." Her grandfather had told her this in a farmhouse outside Uppsala when she was 9 years old, standing barefoot on a floor that was warm in January, and the memory was as clear to her as the cold air around them now. Leroy Blackwell looked at her the way men look at things they do not believe but cannot immediately disprove. He remounted his horse and started north. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped and called back without turning around. "I will come by in January," he said. "If you are alive, I will bring you a cord of wood. If you are not, I will bury you next to Lars." He said it like a practical man accounting for 2 possible outcomes. He did not say it like a man who expected to be delivering wood. Josephine watched him ride out of sight and then returned to her work. The third visitor was different. Gideon Cromwell arrived on a Thursday afternoon riding a good horse and wearing the kind of clean clothing a man wears when he intends to be taken seriously. He was 48 years old, the only professional stove and chimney builder within 30 miles, and he had constructed or repaired the heating systems of 11 of the 14 families living along Stillwater Creek. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a necessary one, and the difference between those two things had kept him comfortable for long enough that he had stopped noticing it. He approached the excavation with a professional expression, tilting his head to examine the angles, studying the rough channeling Josephine had sketched in the clay lining. He made small sounds of consideration. He asked one or two questions that sounded like genuine curiosity, and then he gave his assessment with the careful regret of a man delivering bad news he had anticipated for some time. The problem, he said, is back pressure. When the wind shifts from the northwest, the secondary channel will create a pressure differential that pushes smoke back into the living space. This is why no one builds this way. It is not that the idea lacks cleverness, he said. It is that the implementation produces a flaw that outweighs the benefit. Josephine asked him when he had last built anything other than a conventional single-flue stove and chimney. Gideon said that conventional systems worked reliably. Josephine said that her grandfather's system had worked reliably in Sweden for the better part of a century. Gideon smiled the smile of a man being patient. With all respect, Mrs. Langford, he said, this is not Sweden. He rode away in the direction of the Dunbar property, and that evening he sat with Ambrose Dunbar in front of Ambrose's reliable conventional stove and said what he had been thinking since he first heard about the widow's excavation project. She will choke the flu before Christmas, he said. When that happens and she comes asking for help or asking to borrow wood, let her ask. Either she learns her lesson and sells the land in the spring, or she keeps at it until the cold settles the matter. Either way, it is not our problem to solve for her. Ambrose Dunbar listened to this without responding. He was a man who absorbed information before forming opinions, and he was not yet certain what his opinion was. He poured himself another cup of coffee and said nothing that committed him to anything. What Gideon Crummell did not know, and what Ambrose had not told him, was that Ambrose had counted his wood supply 3 times in the past 2 weeks. He had counted it once in October as a matter of habit, once in November, when the early cold came in harder than expected, and once the previous Sunday after watching Josephine's excavation from the road for a longer time than he was prepared to admit to anyone. Each time he counted, the calculation came out the same. If the winter went as bad as the sign suggested, he would need more wood than he had. Not dramatically more, just enough more to make him uncomfortable about the margin. He did not say any of this to Gideon Cromwell. Lavinia Whitmore came on a Tuesday, which was her habit. She moved through the valley on a rough schedule that had more to do with who needed checking on than with any fixed social arrangement. She was 29 years old and had arrived in Montana Territory 2 years earlier with her husband Wallace and their 3 children, having walked 47 miles of the trail after their ox went lame, having buried 2 babies on the journey north before the surviving ones were old enough to remember it. She approached the frontier with a practical grimness that some people mistook for coldness, and others recognized as the particular economy of a woman who has learned not to spend emotional resources on things she cannot change. She brought Cormac with her. He was 4 years old, her youngest, and he ran ahead of his mother through the open cabin door with the complete confidence of a child who has not yet learned to hesitate. Lavinia entered behind him and found her son standing in the middle of the room looking up at her. Warm, he said. The word was simple and complete the whole of his experience in one syllable. Lavinia stood still for a moment. The excavation was finished. The floorboards were back in place. The fire in the main stove was moderate, the kind of fire you build to maintain temperature rather than the aggressive burning she had expected from a woman who was, by everyone's account, consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. She could feel something coming up through the soles of her boots. Not dramatically, not the kind of heat that makes you step back, just a steadiness that was not there before, a warmth that did not seem to be coming from anywhere specific because it was coming from everywhere at once. She put her hand flat on the floor. She did not pull it away immediately. Josephine made coffee, real coffee, a luxury that November, and they sat across from each other at the table where 2 weeks earlier Josephine had slid a legal document back across to Dorothea Langford. Lavinia listened while Josephine explained the cycle. Hot fires twice a day instead of low fires all day. The stone mass beneath the floor absorbed the heat during the burns and released it slowly for the 20 hours between them. The first time was the hardest, she said, 3 weeks to fully charge the mass. Now 4 hours of good burning maintained the warmth for a full day. The wood consumption was roughly 40% less than a conventional stove burning continuously to achieve the same temperature. Lavinia was calculating. Josephine could see it happening behind her eyes, the same arithmetic every settler ran automatically because on Stillwater Creek, arithmetic was survival, and the numbers either worked or they did not. If you are wrong, Lavinia said, then Leroy Blackwell will bury me next to Lars, Josephine said, and you will tell everyone the Swedish woman proved nothing and died for it. Lavinia looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then she looked at Cormac, who had taken off his boots without being asked and was sitting on the warm floor with his back against the wall and his eyes half closed, completely at peace. Lavinia picked up her coffee cup and said nothing else about the system. But she did not mock it either. And when she left an hour later, she did not take the route past Gideon Cromwell's property, which was the shorter way home. That evening, alone in the cabin with the fire banked and the temperature holding in a way that still felt slightly miraculous even to her, Josephine opened Lars's field journal to the pages she had been filling since October. The numbers were there in her own handwriting, column after column of morning temperatures recorded before the day had a chance to change them. The system was working. She knew that. The evidence was right there in the columns, undeniable and precise. She turned back to the last page Lars had written. The entry was brief. Weather cooling, he had written. First serious frost expected by the end of the week. Wood supply adequate. We'll reassess in February. She thought about the letter Dorothea had brought. She thought about Lars listening to her describe her grandfather's system on the ship from Sweden, and nodding in the way he nodded at things he was filing away under the category of things he did not intend to argue about. He had been a good man, patient in ways that mattered, and impatient in ways that were forgivable. He had loved her in the steady and undemonstrative way of men who show love through continued presence rather than declaration. He had not believed in the stones. She sat with that for a long time, not with anger. The anger had passed sometime in the first weeks after the funeral, burned through quickly like kindling, leaving something slower and more complicated behind. She sat with the specific weight of being right about something that the person you loved most had not believed in. And she sat with the understanding that being right would not feel the way she had always imagined it would feel, because the person whose belief had mattered most was not here to revise his opinion. She was not doing this for Lars. She had thought she was at first. In the days after reading his letter and the first shock of learning that his doubt had been more deliberate than she knew, she had felt the project transform in her hands into something with a sharper edge, a need to prove something to a man who could not hear the proof. But sitting alone in the warm cabin with his journal open on her knee, she understood that this was not what was driving her. She was doing this because her grandfather had taken her hand when she was 9 years old and walked her barefoot across a warm floor in January and told her that this was knowledge worth keeping. She was doing this because she had carried that knowledge across an ocean and across a continent and through 17 years of choosing someone else's practical certainty over her own, and she had arrived at a point where no one was left to choose on her behalf. She closed the journal. Outside, the first serious wind of December pushed against the cabin walls and found very little purchase. The stones beneath the floor held what they had been given and gave it back without drama, without performance, without needing anyone to believe in them first. In the morning, she would add 2 cords to the stone charge. In 3 weeks, the system would be at full capacity. In 6 weeks, if the signs were right, the real winter would arrive. She banked the fire and went to bed and slept straight through until dawn, which was something she had not managed in 3 months. The smoke came on a Thursday, 3 days after Josephine had replaced the last of the floorboards. It was not dramatic. It was not the billowing, choking kind of failure that Gideon Cromwell had described to the Whitfield brothers with such careful specificity. It was a thin thread of gray curling up through a gap between 2 boards near the east wall, visible only because the morning light was coming through the window at a low angle and caught the haze at exactly the right moment. If the light had been different, Josephine might not have seen it for another hour. She stood very still and watched it. The wind outside had shifted overnight. She had felt the change before she was fully awake, the way a person who has been paying close attention to weather learns to feel it in the quality of silence rather than sound. The northwest wind that 2 moons had warned about was not a storm. It was a steady, cold pressure from a specific direction, and it was doing exactly what Gideon Cromwell had said it would do to a secondary channel connected imperfectly to the main flue. Josephine did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had stopped affording herself sometime in the first winter after she and Lars arrived in Montana Territory. when the practical distance between a bad decision and a dead family was short enough to make you either very calm or very dead. She went to the window and studied the exterior of the chimney for a moment. Then she came back to the floor and crouched down and tore a small strip from the edge of the newspaper she had been saving since September, and she held it near the gap in the boards and watched what the smoke did in its presence. She watched for 2 hours, not continuously. She made breakfast, fed the animals, brought in wood. But every 15 minutes she came back to the floor and held the paper strip and watched the direction of the drift. By mid-morning she had what she needed. The problem was not in the channel itself. The problem was in the angle where the secondary passage rejoined the main shaft, a junction she had mortared at what she now understood was approximately 15 degrees too shallow. The negative pressure that normally pulled exhaust upward was being partially overcome by the northwest wind at that specific angle, and the result was a modest but real reversal of flow at the lowest point of the system. She could fix it. She was nearly certain she could fix it, but nearly certain was not the same as certain, and the materials she would need were not all immediately at hand, and the repair would require opening a section of floor she had just finished closing. 2 Moons arrived before noon. She had not sent for him. He came the way he had come every day since the excavation began, unhurried and without announcement, appearing at the edge of the property as though he had simply been in the vicinity and stopped. But he had not been in the vicinity. He had ridden from the Crow encampment 3 miles east, and he had ridden there because he had looked at the sky that morning and understood what the northwest wind meant for the junction she had been worried about since the 3rd week of construction. He saw the smoke before she told him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the thin haze near the east wall, and then looked at her, and between them passed the specific communication of 2 people who had been working on the same problem long enough to have a shared vocabulary. He reached into the pack he carried and produced a cloth bag of gray clay. Not the local clay they had been using for the mortar throughout construction. Something denser, with a different texture, the kind that dried harder and maintained its integrity through the expansion and contraction of repeated heating. He had brought it 3 days ago and left it in the corner near the door without comment. She had noticed it and said nothing because she had learned that 2 Moons communicated through preparation rather than explanation. He set the bag down and began pulling up the floorboards near the east wall without being asked. They worked for 4 hours. 2 Moons from below, applying the clay to the junction in careful layers, building up the angle by degrees, testing the seal between applications by holding a burning twist of grass near the channel and watching the flame behavior. Josephine from above, monitoring the smoke, managing the fire, keeping the temperature in the system steady enough that the clay would begin curing immediately, rather than sitting wet in a cold channel. The repair was not elegant. It was functional and precise and accomplished without a single wasted motion, which on the frontier was its own form of elegance. When the smoke stopped, it stopped completely. When 2 Moons replaced the floorboards and stood up, he brushed the clay from his hands and said one thing. Josephine asked where he had learned about this specific clay. He said simply that his people had been keeping lofts and structures warm through Montana winters longer than there had been in Montana Territory. He said it without pride and without bitterness, just as a statement of chronology. She said thank you. He picked up his pack and left before she could say anything more. What Josephine did not know until 2 days later was that Ambrose Dunbar had ridden past the property on the morning the smoke appeared. He had been going north on his usual route and had no reason to stop. But he had seen her crouched near the window with her face close to the glass, and he had seen the particular expression of a woman examining something that had gone wrong, and he had stored that observation in the part of his mind where he kept information he was not yet sure what to do with. He had not mentioned it to Gideon Cromwell, but Gideon Cromwell had his own sources. The valley was small and the winter had driven people indoors, but not away from their windows, and a thin thread of smoke coming up through a floor was the kind of detail that traveled. By Friday of that week, Gideon had heard about it from a man who had heard about it from the wife of the second Whitfield brother, who had heard it from someone she would not name. By Saturday morning, Gideon had ridden to the Whitfield property and sat in front of the new conventional stove he had built them and said what he had been waiting to say since November. I told her, he said, back pressure. It is not a flaw in her ambition. It is a flaw in the physics. Some things do not work the way we want them to work, and the honest thing is to acknowledge that before someone gets hurt. The elder Whitfield brother nodded. He was a cautious man by nature, and had been grateful for Gideon's expertise when they arrived in the valley with no time to experiment. The younger Whitfield said that he had heard the widow fixed it. Gideon said he had heard the same thing. But fixed was a word that covered a great deal of ground between a real solution and a temporary patch. And the question was whether the patch would hold through a serious storm or whether it would give way at exactly the moment when it could not afford to. He rode home satisfied that he had planted the right seed in the right soil. Josephine found out what he had said from Lavinia Whitmore, who arrived on her usual Tuesday with Cormac on her hip, and the directness of a woman who had decided that the kindest thing she could do was deliver accurate information without editorial comment. She stood in the doorway and said that people were talking. She said specifically what they were talking about. She said that Gideon Cromwell had told the Whitfields that the system was unreliable and that the smoke incident was evidence of a fundamental design flaw. Josephine listened to all of it. Then she asked Lavinia if she wanted coffee. Lavinia set Cormac down. The boy went immediately to a spot near the east wall, the warm section of floor above the deepest part of the stone chamber, and sat down and pulled his boots off with the practiced efficiency of a child who has done something enough times to have a method. He had been doing this since October. Every time Lavinia brought him, he found the same spot. They drank their coffee and Lavinia watched the thermometer on the wall while they talked. The morning reading had been 62 degrees. Outside, it was 19. Lavinia was a woman who understood arithmetic in her body the way farmers understand it, not as abstraction, but as the difference between enough and not enough, between making it to spring and not making it to spring. She did not say what she was thinking, but she drank the coffee slowly. Josephine went to find Gideon Cromwell the following morning. She found him at the Whitfield property finishing the exterior chimney work on the second brother's cabin. He was on a ladder with mortar and a trowel, and he came down when he saw her, which she appreciated. Men who will not come down off a ladder for a conversation they know is coming are men who have already decided the conversation is beneath them. She said what she had come to say without preliminary. She asked him what he had told the Whitfields. He said he had told them the truth, which was that her system had shown evidence of the exact failure he had predicted, and that families new to the valley deserved to know that before they made decisions based on her example. She said that the problem had been identified, understood, and repaired in less than a day. She said that the repair held and the system had been running without incident for 2 weeks since. She said that these were also facts and that he had apparently not felt compelled to share them. Gideon set his trowel against the ladder and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this conversation and prepared for it. He said that he was not her enemy. He said that he had real concerns about real families making real decisions based on an experiment that had not yet been tested through a full winter. He said that he was not trying to hurt her. She said she understood exactly what he was trying to do. He did not respond immediately. The silence between them was the kind that contains more information than speech. She said she knew he was not worried about the Whitfields. She said she knew what 3 new families in the spring would mean for a man whose livelihood depended on being the only person in the valley who knew how to build a reliable heating system. She said this not with anger, but with the flat clarity of someone naming a thing that both parties already understand. Gideon picked up his trowel. He said that, with all respect, she had been in this valley for 7 years, and he had been here for 12, and experience was not nothing. She said she agreed with him completely. She turned and rode home. That evening, Ambrose Dunbar came to find Gideon Cromwell. This was unusual. Ambrose was not a social man, and his relationship with Gideon was practical rather than friendly, the relationship of men who needed each other's competence and respected it without requiring anything warmer. He arrived at Gideon's property near dusk and declined to come inside and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and said what he had been holding for 2 weeks. He said that he had counted his wood 3 times this autumn and the number was not comfortable. He said that the winter was going to be worse than usual. He said that he was a man who made decisions based on evidence, and the evidence from Josephine Langford's cabin every morning for 6 weeks was that her system was producing consistent temperatures in the middle 50s and low 60s on less wood than he was burning to keep his cabin in the middle 40s. Gideon said there had been a smoke incident. Ambrose said he knew. He said the smoke had lasted 1 morning and the fix had held for 2 weeks. Gideon said that one good repair did not make a reliable system. Ambrose looked at him for a moment and said something that surprised both of them. He said that he had not come to argue, He said he had come because he intended to go and look at the system himself to ask Mrs. Langford to show him how it worked, and he had come to tell Gideon that first, rather than have Gideon hear about it from someone else. He said he was telling him because they had been neighbors for 12 years, and that counted for something even when they disagreed. Then he put his hat back on and rode home without waiting for a response. Gideon stood on his porch in the cold for a long time after Ambrose left. The valley was quiet in the way valleys go quiet in December. Every family pulled inward toward its own fire, each household a small island of warmth in a landscape that had stopped pretending to be hospitable. He looked north in the direction of the Caldwell property and south in the direction of his own wood supply, and did the arithmetic that every person in the valley was doing. He went inside without resolving anything. Two Moons came by on a Wednesday in mid-December with a sack over his shoulder and the manner of a man making a final visit before a long absence. He set the sack inside Josephine's door without being asked. It was clay, the same dense gray material he had used for the repair, enough to patch the system 3 more times if it came to that. Then he stood in the doorway and looked north. Not the casual look of a man checking weather. The sustained, specific attention of someone reading something written in the sky and the wind and the behavior of the land. He said that the storm coming was not like the storms she had seen since arriving in Montana Territory. She asked him what he meant. He said that the old people in his community had been talking about the signs since October. Not the ordinary signs of a hard winter, the beaver dams and the caterpillars and the early bird movements that the settlers had also noticed. There were other signs, older ones, that the elders understood in ways he could not fully translate. He said only that when those signs appeared together in a particular pattern, it meant a cold that came quickly and stayed. She asked him how cold. He said he did not know exactly. Cold enough that the difference between what she had built and what her neighbors had built would not be a matter of comfort. He picked up his pack and walked to his horse and rode east without looking back. She stood in the open doorway after he was gone and felt the temperature on her face. It was 15 degrees. The sky to the north had the particular opacity of deep winter, not cloud exactly, but a density that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. She had seen that sky before or something like it, but Two Moons had been doing this longer than she had, and the specific weight in his voice was not the weight of a man describing a season. It was the weight of a man describing a reckoning. She closed the door and went to Lars's journal and wrote the date and the temperature and a single additional line. Two Moons says this one is different. Then she sat with his journal in her lap and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to run the numbers she had been avoiding. She had charged the stone mast to full capacity. She had enough wood to last until late February if she maintained the twice-daily burn cycle she had been running. The system had been tested in temperatures as low as 12 above zero and had performed within 3 degrees of her projections. She had repaired the one fault she had identified, and the repair had held. What she had not tested was what the system would do in temperatures below zero. What she had not tested was whether the granite Two Moons had chosen would maintain its integrity through the kind of thermal stress that comes from a cold snap severe enough to drop temperatures 20 degrees in an afternoon. What she had not tested was whether 4 tons of stone beneath a single-layer plank floor in a 16 by 20-foot cabin could generate enough radiant warmth to keep a person alive when the outside air was cold enough to kill exposed skin in minutes. She had her grandfather's memory. She had 6 weeks of data. She had the evidence of her own body sleeping warm in a single blanket while December howled outside. But she had never stood on the other side of what Two Moons was describing, and she was honest enough to understand the difference between confident and certain. She picked up a pencil, and underneath the line about Two Moons she wrote, "If I am wrong, the cost is mine alone." She stared at that for a moment. Then she drew a line through it and wrote below it, "But if I am right." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. 3 days before Christmas, Ambrose Dunbar rode past the Caldwell property in the late afternoon, going north on his usual route with no intention of stopping. The sky had been doing something all day that he could not name precisely, a kind of held breath quality in the atmosphere, the way air feels before something large releases. He had been a farmer long enough to know that sky. He had been a frontier man long enough to take it seriously. His horse slowed without being asked. Ambrose let it stop. He sat in the saddle and looked at the Langford cabin for a long time. The chimney was putting out steady, moderate smoke. The kind of smoke that comes from a system that is maintaining temperature rather than building it. The kind of smoke that means whoever is inside is not fighting the cold, but managing it. His own chimney that morning had been putting out the thick, constant output of a stove being pushed hard against the temperature. He dismounted and knocked on the door. Josephine opened it, and her expression told him she had not expected him. He had not expected himself either, which was perhaps why he said what he said without the preamble he had been rehearsing. He asked her how many people the system could keep warm at once. She looked at him for a moment and said she did not know. She had not tested it with more than herself. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man filing something away. Then he said that it was probably worth knowing before it became necessary to know. He remounted without saying anything further and rode north. Josephine stood in the open doorway and watched him go until the cold forced her back inside. She was not certain what had just happened. She knew that Ambrose Dunbar had been publicly skeptical of her system for 6 weeks and had said nothing in its defense in any conversation she was aware of. She knew that Gideon Cromwell believed Ambrose was in his corner. She knew that the question Ambrose had just asked was not the question of a man who had dismissed what she was building. She closed the door and added 2 logs to the evening burn and wrote the temperature in Lars's journal and did not write anything else. 2 days before Christmas, the storm came. It came out of Canada in the way of the worst storms, not gradually but all at once, as though the sky had been loading a pressure that finally exceeded what the atmosphere could contain. The temperature dropped 23 degrees in a single afternoon. By dusk, it was 12 below zero. By midnight, it was worse. The wind hit 47 miles per hour and drove snow horizontal across the valley, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet, turning the familiar geography of Stillwater Creek into a featureless white that obliterated every landmark and made the distance between neighbors always significant feel absolute. In the Dunbar cabin, Ambrose and his 2 sons fed the stove every 2 hours through the night and still woke to ice in the water bucket. The interior temperature never climbed above 47 degrees despite burning through wood at a rate that made Ambrose do the math 3 times before dawn and not like the answer any of the 3 times. His wife Margaret wore every layer she owned and still shivered. By morning, her hands were stiff enough that she could not button her own coat. Leroy Blackwell burned 5 large logs through the night to hold 52 degrees and woke at 3 in the morning to reload the firebox with hands that had lost fine motor control from the cold, despite being inside his own cabin with a fire going. In the Whitmore cabin, 300 yards south of the Caldwell property, Wallace Whitmore went outside twice in the dark to bring in wood and lost the feeling in his fingers both times despite heavy gloves. His wife Lavinia held their youngest child close to the stove and watched the heat fail to reach the far corners of the room. The temperature in the cabin hovered somewhere around 40 degrees, which was cold enough to be dangerous for a sick person and cold enough to be miserable for a healthy one. Cormac, who was 4 years old and had the lungs of a child who had come into the world in a difficult journey and never entirely recovered, the ease that other children took for granted, began to cough at midnight. Not the ordinary cough of a child with a cold. The deep, rattling cough that Lavinia recognized from the wagon trail from the months when she had held children who were fighting for warmth their bodies could not generate and losing. By dawn, his breathing had changed. Shallower, more effortful. His lips held the beginning of a color that Lavinia had seen before and never wanted to see again. Josephine Langford had slept through the night in a flannel nightgown with one wool blanket. She had built her evening fire from 5:30 until 9:30, stacking split pine and dead cottonwood until the system was fully charged, until the stones beneath the floor had absorbed everything she could give them. At 10, she let the fire burn down to coals. At midnight, she added 2 logs from habit, not from necessity. At 2 in the morning, the cabin interior was 61 degrees. At 6, when the storm was at the height of its violence and the temperature outside had fallen to 29 below zero, her cabin interior was 58 degrees. She woke naturally, made coffee on coals that had lasted the night, went about her morning as though the worst cold in 5 years was simply weather. She was standing at the window watching the storm when she saw the figure moving through the white. Lavinia Whitmore was running, or trying to run. The snow was packed and drifted in ways that made running something between an intention and a reality, and Lavinia's shawl was inadequate for what she was moving through, and the expression on her face when Josephine opened the door before she could knock was the expression of a woman who has already counted the distance between where she is and where she needs to be, and found the arithmetic terrifying. She said her son's name, just his name. Josephine did not ask for more. She knew the rest from the sound of it. She pulled on Lars's coat. She took the medicine basket from the shelf near the door. Willow bark and pine needle tea and dried elderflower, the things that helped when help was possible. She followed Lavinia out into the storm. The 300 yards to the Whitmore cabin felt like 3 miles. The wind came from the northwest at a direction and force that required constant correction just to maintain a straight line. Josephine kept her head down and watched Lavinia's back and put one foot in front of the other and did not think about anything except the next step and the one after that. Inside the Whitmore cabin, the temperature was near 40 degrees. Wallace was at the stove with an expression that had moved past fear into the mechanical focus of a man doing the only thing he could think of. Cormac was on the bed in the back corner under every quilt and blanket they owned, his breathing audible from the doorway. Lavinia went to him immediately. Josephine followed and looked at the child for 3 seconds. She said to wrap him and bring him. She said to bring all the children. Wallace turned from the stove. He was a reasonable man, and he made a reasonable argument in the voice of a man who was afraid and trying not to sound it. He said that moving a sick child through that storm across 300 yards of open ground in 29 below zero with 47-mile-an-hour wind was a decision that could not be undone if it went wrong. He said the distance was shorter than it sounded. He said the stove was running. He said these things because he loved his son and was terrified and did not know what else to do. Lavinia looked at Josephine. Josephine did not argue with Wallace. She looked at Cormac and then at Lavinia, and she said simply that the warmth in her cabin was not the kind that came from a stove being pushed hard. She said it was the kind that came from the ground up from everywhere at once. She said that warmth was what the boy needed, not just heat from one direction in a room that was still 40 degrees everywhere else. She said they needed to go now. Lavinia Whitmore reached for the nearest blanket and began wrapping her son. Wallace watched his wife for 1 second. Then he stood up and moved to help her. They went out into the storm together, all of them with Cormac held against Josephine's chest inside Lars's coat, and the 2 older girls tucked between the adults, and the wind tried to push them back the entire way. They came through this door in a single motion, all 5 of them stumbling across the threshold, as though the storm had been chasing them personally and only the closed door behind them could end it. The change was immediate and total, not gradual warmth, the kind that builds slowly as a cold room accepts the presence of bodies and fire. What hit the Whitmore family when they crossed into Josephine's cabin was something they had no framework for, because none of them had ever stood inside a space where warmth was rising from beneath their feet and radiating from every surface simultaneously. Wallace Whitmore had been in heated buildings before good ones back in Ohio before they came west. He had stood in front of stoves that threw serious heat. He understood warmth as something that came from a specific direction, something you positioned yourself toward. This was not that. This was warmth that had no direction because it had every direction. It came up through the soles of his boots. It met him from the walls. The air itself held a settled, even temperature that did not vary between head height and floor level, between the center of the room and the corners between standing near the stove and standing at the far wall. He stopped moving the moment he was inside and simply stood there, processing something his body understood before his mind caught up. He said only 3 words, and he said them in the voice of a man who has just understood that he was wrong about something important. He said, "Lord, have mercy." Josephine was already moving. She carried Cormac to the bed at the back of the room, the one positioned directly above the deepest section of the stone chamber, the section where the granite held the most concentrated warmth. She pulled away the outer layers of wet wool, the things that were cold now and would stay cold, and she wrapped him in the dry blankets from the chest beside the bed. She set the medicine basket on the table and began preparing what she needed. The boy's breathing was still labored, still the shallow, tight-chested effort of lungs working against cold that had gotten into them. But within 3 minutes of being placed on that bed, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not the sudden recovery of a story that needs its ending to come quickly. A slow loosening the way icebound rope loosens when brought into warmth fiber by fiber. Cormac's shoulders dropped a fraction. The space between his breaths lengthened slightly. The rigid tension in his small chest eased by a degree that was almost too small to measure, but was not too small to see. Lavinia was on her knees beside the bed with her hand on her son's forehead. She had been on her knees in similar positions before in worse circumstances, and had not always been able to stay. She stayed now. She did not look up or speak. She simply kept her hand on her son's forehead and breathed with him. The elder girl and the younger girl, 6 and 8, had stopped crying somewhere on the walk through the storm. Children that age often go quiet in genuine emergencies, as though they understand instinctively that this is not the moment for their fear. The elder girl took her mittens off. She looked down at the floor. Then she sat down on it. The younger girl watched her sister for a moment and then did the same thing, stretching out on the warm boards with the complete trust of a child who has found a thing that is good and sees no reason to question it. She asked her mother if she could stay there. Lavinia, without looking up, said yes. Wallace stood in the middle of the room for a long time. He was a capable man, a man who moved through most situations with a competence that he wore quietly and spent efficiently. He had no competence available for this situation. He had made an argument against coming here, a reasonable argument based on reasonable fear, and his wife had looked at him and begun wrapping their son anyway, and he had stood up and helped her. And now he was standing in this room where the warmth came from everywhere, and his son was breathing more easily with every passing minute. And the thing he needed to do was something he had not done very many times in his adult life. He said to Josephine, without looking at her directly, "I was wrong to hesitate." She did not say that he had not been wrong. She did not say that his hesitation was understandable or that any father would have done the same. She said nothing at all because the statement did not require a response, and she respected him enough not to offer one. She handed him a cup of coffee instead. He took it and sat down near the stove and held it in his hands and did not speak again for a long time. The storm did not relent that day. By evening, it was clear that it would not relent the following day either. The word spread in the way that word spread in isolated communities, not through any organized system, but through the simple fact that when a family did not appear at an expected time or a light did not show in an expected window, someone went to check, and when they checked and found trouble, they did not leave without telling someone else. By the afternoon of the second day, 7 more people had made their way to the Caldwell property. Ambrose Dunbar came with his wife Margaret. He had known from the morning of the first full day that the storm was beyond what his cabin could handle at the rate he was burning wood, and he had known it with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 20 years not being wrong about these calculations and had just run out of margin. He did not announce his arrival or explain it. He knocked, came in, helped Margaret to a chair near the warm floor, and then stood against the wall with his arms folded and looked at everything in the room with the expression of a man taking precise inventory. Leroy Blackwell arrived alone in the late afternoon of the second day, having ridden through conditions that should have kept him home carrying a thermometer in his coat pocket. He shook the snow from his hat and coat in the doorway and stood for a moment in the warmth before producing the thermometer with the methodical care of a man who trusts instruments over impressions. He held it at chest height in the center of the room for a full minute. He read it. He went back outside and held it in the open air for 30 seconds. He came back in pod and read it again. He said nothing immediately. He went to the exterior wall, the coldest wall, and held the thermometer there. He read it, he crouched and held it near the floor. He read it, he stood and held it near the ceiling. He read it. The readings did not vary by more than 3 degrees across the entire cabin. He put the thermometer in his pocket and sat down on the floor near Ambrose Dunbar and took out a small notebook and a pencil stub and began to write. Ambrose watched him for a moment and said, "What does it say?" Calvin said 61 degrees at center height. He said his own cabin with the stove running when he left it had been reading 38. Neither man said anything after that for several minutes. The cabin now held 13 people, 2 adults and 3 children from the Whitmore family, Ambrose and Margaret Garrett, Leroy Blackwell, 4 others from neighboring properties who had found their own heating situations untenable and had made the same calculation the others had made. The temperature inside never dropped below 57 degrees. Outside the thermometer, Calvin went to check at the door each morning, read numbers that made the 57 degrees inside feel like a different world, on a different planet rather than a different building on the same creek. Josephine managed the system through all of it. She maintained the burn cycle, built up the stone charge each evening, monitored the temperature with the same disciplined regularity she had been practicing since October. She cooked for 13 people on a stove that was designed for 2. She organized sleeping arrangements with the efficiency of a woman who understood that comfort was not the priority and warmth was. She did all of this without drama and without calling attention to what she was doing, because the doing of it was its own argument. On the afternoon of the second day, Lucinda Cromwell arrived. She came without her husband and without announcement. She had been making the decision since morning, when the temperature inside her own cabin had dropped below what she could manage with the children present, and when her youngest daughter's fingers had gone white at the tips for the second time in an hour despite being held close to the stove. Lucinda Cromwell was 44 years old and had been married to a practical man for 22 years and had learned to make practical decisions quickly. She wrapped her daughter in everything available and walked 400 yards through the storm to the Caldwell property and knocked on the door. Josephine opened it. Lucinda came inside with her daughter and went to the warm floor and began unwrapping the child's hands and chafing them gently, and did not say a single word that required a response. The child's color began to return within minutes. Lucinda sat down on the floor beside her and kept her hands moving over the small, cold fingers and stared at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who has made a decision she is not sorry for. Gideon Cromwell came 2 hours later. He did not knock with the authority he usually carried. He opened the door and stood on the threshold looking for his wife, and when he found her on the floor with their daughter, he did not speak immediately. He looked at Lucinda, and he looked at the child, and he looked at the room full of people sitting on the warm floor of a cabin he had spent 2 months telling this valley was going to fail. Josephine did not say anything to him. She did not look at him with satisfaction or with reproach. She simply moved aside to make space in the doorway and said there was room. He came in. He found a place near the wall and sat down and did not speak for the rest of that day. He was not a man who processed things quickly in public, and this was a large thing to process. He sat with it. On the third day of the storm, when the wood supply was holding and the temperature had not wavered, and Cormac Whitmore was sitting up and eating broth, and the color had returned to Lucinda Cromwell's daughter's hands, Ambrose Dunbar sat down on the floor directly above the center of the stone chamber and said what had been building in him for 3 days. He had been a builder for 30 years, he said. He had put up structures in 3 territories and had been confident in every one of them. He had dismissed what Josephine Langford was building as the mistake of a grieving woman who did not know construction and was spending her grief on something impractical. He had believed this not because he was cruel, but because his entire experience told him it was true. He said he was wrong. He said it plainly without the qualifications that men often attach to admissions of this kind. He did not say he had been wrong given what he knew at the time. He did not say he had made a reasonable judgment with the information available. He said he was wrong present tense as a statement about the current state of his understanding. Then he looked at her and asked if she would teach him. He said he wanted to build the system before spring. He said he wanted to understand it well enough to build it correctly, not just copy it because a copied system was only as good as the copying, and he did not believe in building things he did not understand. Josephine looked at this man who had stood at the edge of her excavation in November and told her she would burn through her wood supply and die for a foolish idea. She looked at him sitting on the warm floor with his pride folded somewhere inside him where it was no longer in the way. She said yes. Leroy Blackwell, who had been writing steadily in his notebook through this exchange, looked up and said one thing to Josephine. He said, "Did Lars know you were going to do this?" She said Lars had known she wanted to. She said he had not believed in it. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had told her in November that he would bury her next to Lars if she did not survive the winter. He said he had believed when he said it that he was being practical rather than cruel, that he was giving her a clear-eyed assessment of her chances, and that he had been wrong about her chances, and wrong about the clarity of his own eyes. He said, "I owe you an apology for the part I played in making this harder than it needed to be." He said it the way former soldiers say difficult things directly and without decoration, because he had learned that the performance of remorse was its own form of self-indulgence. Josephine accepted it the way she had accepted everything over the past 3 months without excessive ceremony. She said she understood why he had said what he said. She said she did not think he had been trying to harm her. He said he had not been. He said that did not change what he owed her. That evening, after the others had settled into sleep in various arrangements around the warm room, Gideon Cromwell found Josephine at the table with Lars's journal open in front of her. The lamp was low. Everyone else was either asleep or close to it. He sat down across from her in the chair Dorothea had occupied 6 weeks earlier, and he did not pretend that was not significant. He did not apologize for what he had done. She had not expected him to, and she would not have trusted it if he had, because Gideon Cromwell was a man who acted from calculation rather than feeling, and a calculated apology was worth considerably less than a calculated concession. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. On it were the names of two families who would be arriving in the valley in April to file homestead claims on parcels that had been vacant since the previous year. They would need heating systems. Everyone who arrived in the valley needed heating systems. He said he could build conventional stoves for both of them. He said he could also do the chimney and flue work if she was willing to teach the underground system to the families directly. He said that both components were necessary and he was better at one of them than she was. He said this without embarrassment because it was true, and because Gideon Cromwell had always found it easier to acknowledge other people's competence than to acknowledge his own failures. Josephine looked at the paper. She looked at him. She said she would do it if he told them the full truth about both systems, including what each one could and could not do. She said she would not have families in this valley making decisions based on incomplete information. He said that was fair. She said that was the condition. He picked up the paper and put it back in his coat and stood and went to find a place to sleep. At the door, he stopped without turning around. He said, "You have more of your grandfather in you than Lars probably knew." She did not respond. But after he had gone, she sat for a long time with the journal open to the pages she had been filling since October. And she thought about what Gideon had said, and she thought about her grandfather's farmhouse outside Uppsala and the warm floor and the 9-year-old girl who had stood on it barefoot in January, and known without being told that this was worth knowing. She turned back to the last entry Lars had written. Then she turned forward to her own pages, column after column of temperatures recorded in the same careful hand he had used for his planting notes and weather observations. 2 records in the same book, 2 different ways of watching the same land. She understood something then that she had been approaching for weeks without quite reaching. She had not built the system to prove Lars wrong. She had not built it to prove Ambrose Dunbar wrong, or Leroy Blackwell, or Gideon Cromwell. She had built it because her grandfather had given her a piece of knowledge that deserved to be used rather than carried, and because Lars's death had removed the last reason she had been giving herself to carry it unused. She did not know if Lars would have changed his mind, given enough time and enough evidence. She suspected he might have. He was a practical man, and the evidence was decisive, and he had loved her in his steady way. That included, she thought, a willingness to be surprised by her. She would never know. That was the fact she had been living inside since August, the particular shape of loss that comes not from cruelty or failure, but from time running out before the story had a chance to find its proper ending. She closed the journal. She set it on the shelf where Lars had kept it. She went to the stove and added 2 logs and checked the damper and went to bed. The storm broke on December 28th. The valley woke to a stillness that was its own kind of event after 3 days of wind. The sky was a flat white that held no further threat. The temperature was still below zero, but the kind of below zero that can be worked with that yields to layered clothing and purposeful movement rather than defeating both on contact. The families left the Langford cabin over the course of the morning, by ones and twos returning to their own properties to assess whatever damage 3 days of extreme cold had done to their animals and their structures. Each departure was quiet. The gratitude in the room had passed beyond the stage where it required expression and reached the stage where it simply existed as a quality of the air between people. Ambrose Dunbar was the last to leave after his wife had already started home. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was becoming a habit with him at this threshold, and he said that he would be back in 3 days with questions about excavation depth and the particular granite she had used. She said she would be here. He said he knew. He put his hat on and left. In the weeks that followed, the valley reorganized itself around a new understanding. Ambrose Dunbar returned with his notebook and spent 2 afternoons asking questions he wrote down completely before she had finished answering them. He returned a 3rd time with measurements he had taken of his own cabin floor and a plan for where the chamber would go. He began excavating in February, hiring 2 men from Billings to help with the frozen ground, and he drove his sons 38 miles round trip to a granite outcropping he had identified from Josephine's description of the deep channel stone. Leroy Blackwell took a different approach, as he took a different approach to most things. He built his system not as a retrofit, but as the foundation of an entirely new cabin, incorporating the stone mass into the walls and floor from the first course of logs. He spent the late winter doing calculations working out thermal conductivity and heat loss per degree of temperature differential in the mathematics of stone mass versus air volume. He shared the results with Josephine in a letter which was the first letter she had received since Dorothea's departure, and which she read 3 times. His cabin, he wrote in the following January, had held above 55 degrees for 36 hours after the fire went completely out. He wrote this as a fact, without commentary, in the way he had written everything since she had known him. Wallace Whitmore brought his 2 older sons and spent 2 weeks in January doing labor around the Caldwell property, cutting and stacking wood, repairing the fence line that had come down in the storm, rechinking the north wall where the cold had found gaps. He did not speak about the night of the storm or about his hesitation before it. He worked with the focused diligence of a man paying a debt he had accepted in full. Cormac Whitmore recovered completely within a week of the storm. By February, he was running between the cabin and the barn in the cold with the reckless confidence of a 4-year-old who has no memory of being frightened because fear and recovery are equally complete at that age. Lavinia brought him to see Josephine twice a month through the rest of the winter, and each time he went directly to his spot on the warm floor and sat down as though claiming something that belonged to him. Gideon Cromwell built the underground system for the 2 April families, as he had said he would, with Josephine teaching the families themselves and Gideon handling the chimney and flue connections. He did not speak to Josephine during these visits more than the work required, but he did the work correctly, and he told the families accurately what both systems could do. And in the spring, when one of the April families asked him what kind of stove he would recommend for their kitchen, he said, a conventional cast iron range for cooking, and then he said that for heating through the winter, they should talk to the widow Langford. He said it once and did not say it again, but once was enough. By March of 1878, 4 families along Stillwater Creek had begun excavations. By the following winter, 5 cabins were running underground thermal systems. The results were not identical to Josephine's because the stone varied and the construction varied and the operators varied, but the direction was consistent. Less wood, more warmth, fewer nights of fighting an inadequate system to protect sleeping children from temperatures that wanted them dead. 2 moons returned in the spring as Josephine had hoped, but not assumed he would. He came on a warm April afternoon when the ground was soft and the creek was running with snowmelt, and he did not bring tools or clay or any practical offering. He came with a question. He asked if she would teach him to read the numbers in the journal, not the letters, the numbers, the temperature records she had been keeping since October, the columns of data that documented what the system had done through one of the worst winters the valley had seen. She taught him to read the thermometer and to write the numbers in the margin of a blank page she gave him from the back of the journal. He practiced for an hour carefully and without hurry until the motion was reliable. He recorded the temperature that afternoon, the first warm reading of spring, and he wrote the date beside it in the careful print she had shown him. She had learned about granite from him. He had learned to measure from her. She thought about her grandfather, who had given her the knowledge to build this system, and she thought about the Crow elders who had given 2 moons the knowledge about stone and heat that predated every thermometer in the valley. Knowledge that kept people alive traveled in whatever direction it needed to travel, and the direction changed depending on who was standing where. He left in the late afternoon, riding east toward the encampment with the blank page folded in his coat pocket. She watched him go from the doorway, as she had watched many people go from that doorway over the past months, and then she went inside to bank the evening fire. In the summer of 1880, a man named Edward Voss rode into the Stillwater Creek Valley carrying a census ledger and a surveyor's level and the assignment to document homestead improvements for the territorial record. He was an engineer by training and a government employee by necessity, and he had the specific quality of attention that comes from a man who is professionally required to observe accurately and personally inclined to find things interesting. He spent 3 days in the valley. He measured. He sketched. He asked questions of every family willing to answer them. He wrote in his ledger that the settlement along Stillwater Creek showed advanced heating systems not observed elsewhere in Montana Territory, with settlers reporting 40 to 60% fuel savings and measurable survival advantages during severe winter months. He noted that the technology appeared to derive from Northern European tradition and had spread from immigrant settlers to native-born American families. He submitted his report to the territorial government in Helena with a recommendation that similar systems be considered for military installations and government buildings throughout the territory. Nothing came of the recommendation. Governments move at their own pace, which is rarely the pace of practical necessity, and by the time anyone in Helena might have authorized funding for experimental heating projects, the railroad had arrived bringing coal, and coal had changed the arithmetic in ways that made frontier ingenuity seem less urgent than it had been when survival was the primary engineering problem. But in the valley, the knowledge persisted. Josephine Langford lived in her cabin until 1891 when she was 55 years old. She sold the property that year to a German couple newly arrived from Bavaria, a man and woman who had come to Montana with the particular seriousness of immigrants who have thought carefully about what they are doing and why. She spent 3 afternoons showing them how the system worked, how to read the seasonal charge cycles, how to identify the warning signs before a problem became a failure. They listened with the attention of people who have learned that practical knowledge in a new country is not a courtesy, but a necessity. The couple maintained the system for 32 years. In 1923, they sold the property to a family from the eastern part of the state, people who had grown up with coal furnaces and steam radiators and had no framework for understanding what lay beneath the floor of the old cabin. The new owners found the underground chamber during an initial inspection, determined that it was an old feature of unclear purpose, and covered it over with new boards and installed a conventional iron stove. They were not careless people. They simply did not know what they were looking at. The stones stayed where they were. In 2019, 142 years after Josephine Langford began digging on a cold November morning, while her neighbors shook their heads, a couple from Seattle purchased the old property through a Montana land conservation program. They were historians with a professional interest in frontier architecture and a personal interest in what the land remembered that the records had forgotten. During the first winter of restoration work, they noticed something. The floor ran warm in sections, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone who was not paying close attention, but warm in a way that did not correspond to any heat source they had installed, warm in a way that persisted through cold nights when the cabin had no fire running. They pulled up the floor. 4 tons of granite still in place after 142 years. Clay-lined channels partially collapsed in sections, but unmistakable in their intent. The dimensions matched nothing in any standard building reference they consulted. They contacted the history department at Montana State University, which sent a graduate student named Maria Chen to have a look. She stayed for 6 weeks. She found Edward Voss's original census report in the Territorial Archives in Helena, including his detailed sketches of the system and his recommendation that was never acted upon. She located descendants of the Dunbar and Whitmore and Blackwell families, people who had heard the stories secondhand and thirdhand, but had kept them the way families keep things that matter without always knowing why they matter. She found a great-grandson of Wallace Whitmore, who had grown up hearing about the night his great-grandfather had hesitated in the doorway of their cold cabin, and his great-grandmother had started wrapping the youngest child in wool and moving toward the door. She wrote her thesis on thermal mass heating in frontier Montana using the Langford cabin as her primary case study. She documented the physics, the history, the survival mathematics of a valley that had come through a brutal winter with fewer casualties than the surrounding region, because one woman had remembered what her grandfather taught her. The obituary Josephine Langford received in the Helena Independent in 1908 described her as a longtime resident and widow of pioneer Lars Langford, survived by various nieces and nephews of Columbus, Ohio. It mentioned her contributions to the Methodist congregation and her reputation for generosity toward new families settling in the valley. It did not mention the stones. It did not mention the winter of 1877. It did not mention 4 tons of granite, or 13 people on a warm floor, or a 4-year-old boy who breathed more easily every minute he lay above the heat that the earth had been asked to hold and had held. That was how most of it was lost. Not dramatically, not in fire or flood, just in the ordinary passage of time, through which useful things become invisible when something more convenient arrives, to replace them in the people who remember why the old thing mattered, get older and quieter, and eventually stop being here to tell it. But sometimes, not often, someone pulls up an old floor and finds what was left underneath. The stones are still there. 4 tons of granite in a 7-foot cavity below floorboards that someone nailed shut in 1923 without understanding what they were covering. Silent, cooled now to the temperature of the surrounding earth, no longer doing the work they were built to do. But there. There because a woman of 41 years, 3 months after burying her husband, hired 2 men with shovels and started digging, while her neighbors predicted her death and a man whose livelihood she threatened worked quietly against her. And the first serious winter in 5 years was building itself in the Canadian North. There because she remembered what her grandfather told her on a warm floor in January when she was 9 years old, and she carried that memory across an ocean and a continent in 17 years of someone else's practical certainty. And when the last reason to wait was gone, she built it. The knowledge is not new. It was old when Josephine Langford used it. It was old when her grandfather used it. It was old when 2 moons understood the stone. It was old when the Romans built their heated floors 2,000 years before anyone called this land Montana. Knowledge that keeps people alive does not belong to the person who uses it. It passes through them from everyone who knew it before. What Josephine Langford did was refuse to let it stop passing. The floor in the old cabin runs warm in winter, not from any installed system, just from the memory of heat in 4 tons of stone that spent years absorbing everything a woman gave them and learned to give it back. Some things hold what they are given for longer than anyone expects.